Happy Friday, everyone. I'm back for the third time this week. I'm sure you didn't miss me too much in the intervening period of Thursday, where it's like, where's Kaizen? How am I going to make sense of the news? And we got the Epstein stuff, and we got Hulk Hogan dying, and Ozzy Osbourne dying, and now we got this stuff going on in Gaza. Like, how are we going to make sense of the news? Well, fear not, I'm back. And today we're going to talk about maybe the most geopolitically charged, emotionally laden topic on earth, which is the conflict in Gaza. And before I get into this topic, I find that every time I see anyone talk about Israel, Palestine, Hamas, Netanyahu, any of these topics, it's like all of a sudden a crazy amount of emotion comes out, understandably, because we're talking about human suffering. But I've noticed there's a different level even than other conflicts in the world, like Ukraine, Russia, for example, where many more people have died, because I think there's something about the conflict in Gaza that touches on people's intuitions about religion, about ownership of land, about ancestry, about race, about colonization. And yeah, there's something about it where it brings out, I think, everyone's deepest held beliefs and values in a way that I think also shuts down people's ability to even understand the other side and try to arrive at constructive solutions. So invariably, it's like when I talk about the pro-Israel stance, I get accused of being a Zionist or taking money from Zionists. When I talk about the pro-Palestine view, I get accused of being a Hamas sympathizer, and it's just ridiculous. And it's like, me personally, I'm just a person. I don't have any particular affinity for either side. I have Jewish friends, I have Arab friends, I even have one Palestinian friend. And I don't have any personal investment in all of this besides just being a human being who wants to see a minimization of the loss of life and being someone who is an influencer trying to influence a higher level of discourse around this stuff. So I say that as a disclaimer. Please don't walk into this to hear your side affirmed. I'm going to try to give a fair analysis and fair read on both sides, but rather come to a consensus on, hey, what are constructive solutions we can actually identify as humanity that just like get us out of all of this insane, horrific killing and death and starvation and suffering. So that's a perspective I'm coming at this from. And the reason this is relevant today is because there have been some updates over the last week or so about the conflict in Gaza. So in the last week, the US and Israel suspended negotiations with Hamas. Stephen Witkoff and the negotiation team from the US actually just pulled out. They said Hamas is not demonstrating a good faith desire to negotiate. And they decided, hey, we've had enough from it. Now, we don't know if this is a negotiation tactic to create more leverage and tell Hamas, hey, if you don't come to the table, we're going to stop talking, or if they're legitimately done negotiating, but that's the latest update. Alongside of that, over the last weekend, there were reports that there were people killed in the efforts for them to get aid, like food aid. So for those of you who are not familiar with the situation, Israel controls the Gaza Strip right now. I think that's objective to say. And they also control how many food trucks get through. Now, there's all sorts of complications around allowing food trucks through because from Israel's perspective, well, they don't want food to get to Hamas because that helps the people that they're trying to destroy. And they also don't want things smuggled in with the food shipments like fertilizer that could be turned into bombs or things like that. And then from the Palestinian side, they have 1.8 million people facing extreme hunger and starvation in Gaza, and 70% of children under 5 are malnourished. So it's a really dire situation. And Israel is trying to coordinate with the UN and UNICEF and World Health Organization and other third parties to get food in there, but they're trying to do this while keeping a safe environment. Over the weekend, there were reports of the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, opening fire on some of the Palestinians who were trying to get food. Now, IDF said that in their defense, they opened fire on people who were actually being threatening toward the IDF, and they opened fire on people who were showing erratic patterns of behavior. It's hard to tell how much of this is true, how much of this is false. What we do know is that the IDF did open what they called warning shots, and it's likely that people died while trying to get food. So you can imagine all the chaos and all the bereavement and suffering and confusion that's going on in this situation. But what we know for a fact is that many people have died in Gaza, and many people are malnourished. Some of those people are starving, and multiple third-party agencies have said, yeah, we have a potentially catastrophic situation on our hands and a famine. And some people in the pro-Israel camp have said, well, yeah, this is due to Hamas stealing aid. And they said that just like they've inflated statistics around how many people have died in Gaza, because a lot of our statistics about how many people have died in Gaza, I think the latest estimates are around 59,000, are based on the Gaza Ministry of Health's estimates. But the Gaza Ministry of Health is controlled by Hamas. That said, it's pretty obvious that tens of thousands of people have died. What ratio of that is civilians versus combatants? Unclear. Whether it's 60,000 people or 40,000 people or 50,000 people, unclear. But we know that many people have died and many people are malnourished and or starving. And we also know that both the UN and the US said that Gaza needs at least 500 to 600 trucks of aid per day in order to feed the Gazan population. Israeli data indicates that only about 140 to 150 trucks have entered on average per day since the conflict has started. So again, we can all agree, not enough food is getting in there. So yeah, there's a tremendous risk of starvation. And even if Hamas is responsible for diverting some of that aid, well, not enough aid is getting in the first place for them to divert. Now, zooming out here, because people are so quick to say, well, this is Hamas' fault or it's Israel's fault. From Israel's perspective, you might believe that in the cold calculus of war, it's simply necessary to do this to some degree. That force is necessary to get Hamas to return the hostages and to Hamas, to disarm Hamas, which is part of Israel's objective. They've been very clear. We want our hostages returned, and we want Hamas to disarm. We want them to never be able to do what they did on October 7th again. And the honest truth is, yeah, some force is required when you're dealing with a body that is using violence against you, right? So some force is clearly necessary. But there's a deeper question here that I think you should ask, even if you're on the pro-Israeli camp, which is, what does defeating Hamas actually mean? And what does victory actually look like? Is it victory if an entire generation of Palestinian children grows up remembering hunger and being given rations while they were starving by men in Israeli uniforms? Is it victory if those same children in 10 years become the next group of extremists and repeat October 7th and continue this whole cycle? Because here's the fundamental problem with trying to defeat Hamas. Hamas is not just a group, it's an idea. And that idea finds very fertile soil in conditions of suffering, which is what's happening in Palestine and Gaza right now. Now, support for that idea, the idea being Hamas, has declined. So in December of 2023, which was 2 months after October 7th, support for Hamas was about 42%, and it's declined to 37% as of May in 2025. So there's been some modest decline, but there's still pretty strong support for Hamas. And that support thrives in misery, because even though only 37% of people in Gaza support Hamas, and that's relative to other political parties, and then, like Fatah, for example, and then some people have just chosen that they don't support any political party there. Well, more Gazans blame Israel and the US for their suffering, 51% of Gazans. Only 12% of Gazans blame Hamas for their suffering. So just thinking strategically here, again, not about sides and right and wrong, just thinking strategically. if you defeat Hamas, quote unquote defeat, but over 1 million people blame you for their suffering, have you defeated Hamas or just its current form? Now, it makes perfect sense that if you're the Israeli government, you have to dismantle the current Hamas that exists. And to be clear, in my opinion, a Palestine run by Hamas is not a free Palestine. This is a Hamas that kills dissidents, that likely is stealing food and using it as ransom against their own people. And that's why 48% of Palestinians actually supported the recent anti-Hamas protests that were happening in Gaza, which, by the way, takes a tremendous amount of bravery because Palestine, or Gaza in particular, is not a place where you have free speech protections in the First Amendment, not a place where, as a civilian, you have the right to bear arms. No, if you're protesting Hamas, it's not like the US. You can be killed, and some people were. So I don't believe that you can have a free Palestine with Hamas running it. But if Israel continues to bomb and starve Gaza with no clear plan for what comes next, there will continue to be resentment. And that resentment will just replace one Hamas with another. Hamas is not a political party as much as it is an idea that has power from this perpetual cycle of violence and, yeah, Israel controlling the future of the people in Palestine. And it makes total sense after, the founding of Israel and the 6-Day War and all the things that Israel went through. It makes total sense for them to say, hey, we just got to control the Palestinian people, and we got to have blockades, and we got to occupy the land, because if we don't do that, they're going to strike back at us. So Israel's faced with an incredibly difficult task of trying to protect themselves through controlling the movements of another people, but also trying to prosecute a war to kill the political party that controls those people, while trying to also minimize civilian casualties. And they have tried to minimize civilian casualties, and they have tried to allow more aid. In fact, today, they indicated that they're now open to having more airdrops to deliver more aid. So they recognize what's going on. And personally, I do not believe that they're trying to commit a genocide. Genocide is a very specific term with a legal definition. It requires the intent to eradicate a specific group, ethnic or religious group. Now, do I believe that there are factions of the Israeli government that are trying to remove Palestinians from Gaza because they've just decided that, hey, we just can't coexist peacefully with these people? Yeah. Oh. Wow, could you guys hear me this whole time? I hope you could. Anyway, my mic was down. Hopefully this is better. So tell me in the chat if you were able to hear that all, because this is important. Yeah, I'm a bit muffled. Okay, but it sounds like people were able to hear me roughly. So sorry about that. Maybe we just have to go back and do this whole thing. But yeah, I do think Israel is trying to prosecute this war while holding some sort of ethical standard. I don't believe they're trying to commit a genocide. And at the same time, there comes a point where you're so focused on defeating your enemy that you're willing to tolerate too high of a civilian cost. And that's my concern here. And considering Hamas's tactics, like, allegedly burying tunnels under schools and hospitals and other civilian infrastructure, it's totally understandable why many Israelis feel that the critique of the Israeli government here is unfair, because they're like, well, look at what Hamas is doing. And after all, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and still October 7th happened. So their frustration is understandable. But there's a lesson to be learned here, even in the withdrawal in 2005, because, yeah, they withdrew. But it's not enough to withdraw the stick. You have to also offer the carrot. Because the idea of Hamas gets power from suffering. So even after 2005, and Israel, they deserve credit for unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza, they still controlled maritime access to Gaza. They still controlled the airspace over Gaza. They still got to control what got to enter and leave the country. Now, in the US, We threw a whole revolution over the prices of tea. Okay? People don't like being controlled. And they don't like being controlled even if you have a very good reason for controlling them. It's like if you put people in a cage, they're going to become rabid. So I'm not here to relitigate the past. I want to make sure that we're taking the lessons from the past toward the future so that we never have to see situations like the conflict in Gaza again. And my fundamental concern about the way that the Israeli government is prosecuting this war is there appears to be no vision for what happens after the war. There's not a clear articulation of, okay, once we've removed Hamas and we've gotten the hostages back and we've dismantled their ability to ever fight back against us again, what they're going to do next. Is Gaza going to remain in ruins? Is Israel going to install a military occupancy of Gaza again? Are all the people in Gaza going to be forced into other parts of the Middle East, into their neighboring countries? There needs to be a vision here. And if there is a vision currently being articulated within the Israeli government, it's not clear to the rest of the world. And that vision needs to be of a future that is so prosperous that the Palestinian people choose to reject extremism themselves. That's what has to happen. And again, 48% of Palestinians in Gaza supported the anti-Hamas protests that happened 3 months ago. Okay, there is a possibility here. And part of my concern is that there are some elements of the pro-Israel camp, not all of them, who believe these people are just animals and there's no reasoning with them and they're too brainwashed. And they point to the fact that, yes, anti-Semitism is taught in schools in Palestine. Yes, Hamas has propagandized and brainwashed the populace. But if you believe that these people are so far gone, then of course there's only one conclusion: to eliminate those people, either from the planet or from Gaza. And we certainly don't want to get to that conclusion. That's a conclusion that happens if you think that the Palestinian people can't be reformed. Now, some people would say, oh, well, that's kind of naive to believe that they can be reformed. I mean, look at what they did, right? They elected Hamas, after all, in 2006. Yeah, they did. And remember, that was 2006. That was 19 years ago. Palestine has a very young population. A massive portion of the Palestinian audience and Palestinian people weren't even alive when Hamas was elected. And people are malleable. If you give them good conditions, they're less likely to do bad things. But we don't even need to believe that it's possible just by looking in this situation and theorizing. We could just look at history. After World War II, the US helped rebuild Germany and Japan, countries we had just bombed. The bombing of Dresden, 20 to 25,000 German civilians, yes, and military, but civilians bombed, devastated, a whole city wiped out. And then we don't need any reminder of what happened in Japan. We dropped 2 nuclear bombs. Okay, besides the number of people killed, there's permanent damage done to those areas, birth defects of kids who were exposed to the nuclear radiation, the first time ever that anyone had used a nuclear weapon. Japan and Germany had every reason to hate the West forever, but they don't today. Why is that? How can you drop 2 nukes on Japan and have a Germany that was massively radicalized become the opposite? In fact, I think Germans actually struggle for a lack of national pride, and the Japanese are one of the US's closest trade partners. How did we get to that point? Well, it's because those people chose peace and they rejected radicalism because they were offered a better path. They were given an economic path to prosperity. We helped reform their education systems. In the case of Japan, they even reformed their constitution to reject
having a military force that could be aggressive again. We transformed their cultures. And that's why we don't have issues with them now. So, you could argue that it's very hard to do that in Palestine. In fact, it's even harder because there's a religious component to it, right? So this is about religiously motivated fundamentalism. That's part of what is behind Hamas, right? Hamas is motivated by Islamic fundamentalism and Islamism, and the Islamic Republic and Iran supports them just as they support Hezbollah, right? So it's particularly difficult, perhaps even more difficult than denazifying Germany or de-radicalizing Japan. But it's not impossible. We could just look at history to give us hope. I'm not saying that Israel should have never retaliated for October 7th. A proportionate response was needed. And I also don't want to impose Western values on what's going on in the Middle East, because sometimes the only language that people understand is violence. There's a logic to violence. Violence undergirds civilization. In fact, the only reason we don't have tons of violence between the 9 billion people on this planet is because of civilization. But violence is the norm. So I understand sometimes you need to assert a boundary. You need force, but you also need to give people power, not just force. And it actually requires more than just Israel, because a lot of people are pointing at the Israeli government. And yeah, there should absolutely be accountability for the Israeli government. And I do believe that they committed war crimes. And you know how I know that? Well, in every war, there's war crimes. War is hell. War is evil. Israel's doing an evil thing, and they're responding to evil. It's all evil. Killing people's evil. People starving is evil. Bombing entire cities is evil. Kids walking around without limbs, that's evil. So yeah, we shouldn't hide from the fact that evil is being done. You might believe that evil is necessary. There's a lot of evil in humanity. But we should, even though I'm not willing to call it genocide, because I don't think it's that. I don't think it meets a legal definition of genocide. Yeah, they're doing evil things. And they're trying to be restrained. It's a very complex situation. But this is not all on Israel. There are neighbors in that region: Jordan, Egypt, UAE, which, to be fair, has been getting more involved, Saudi Arabia. There are neighbors in that region who need to step in and co-create the vision of a better future for Palestine, because they should have very strong interest in having peace in their backyard. And there's actually some good signs there, because if you'll recall, back in, this might have been like February at this point, when Trump mentioned that he wanted to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, that caused a chain reaction, because the Arab nations held an emergency summit and they outlined a plan, a $20 billion plan to rebuild Gaza. So there's a possibility here of other people pitching in, because it can't just be Israel, right? There's no situation where Israel occupies Gaza and the Gazans are okay with that. We're just going to keep repeating the same cycle. So there needs to be a multi-nation coalition stepping in here. But none of this is possible if the Israeli government's only goal is to defeat Hamas. Because if all you see is an enemy, you can't make friends. So what does it actually mean to defeat Hamas? And does that involve a vision of creation or just devastation? And I'd also say, to the Free Palestine movement, and I posted a video about this several months ago that I'm still getting heat for. What does Free Palestine actually mean? Does Free Palestine mean a Hamas who has leaders who likely siphon money that gets sent to the Palestinian people, definitely doesn't even have their kids living in Gaza, but instead are sending their kids to schools in Qatar? And I don't blame them, but let's not act like a lot of these people are fully committed and have all their skin in the game. Some of these people, the political wing of Hamas, they're in Qatar. They're not even in Gaza. They don't even have to deal with the consequences of their action. These are people who kill Palestinian civilians who protest them. This is a very corrupt group of leaders. And I understand why many Palestinian people or the pro-Palestine camp say, well, they're part of the resistance. So if they weren't resisting, then Israel would just kill them all. okay, I get the enemy of your enemy is your friend logic, but the enemy of your enemy is still your enemy. So I'd also like to see the Free Palestine movement be more critical of Hamas. And some of them are, some of them aren't though. Right? There's this whole rash of this whole movement of students at campuses like Columbia University and MIT at college graduations saying free Palestine, free Palestine. I didn't see any of them condemn Hamas. That's important and important to continue doing in the same breath that you condemn in Israel. You can even think that there's not a moral equivalence. You can think that Israel is doing more evil than Hamas, but you still need to call out Hamas because they're part of the causal chain that created this whole situation. So what does free Palestine look like? Because if Israel just stops attacking today and Hamas still controls Palestine, I would argue that's not a free Palestine. So if you really want full sovereignty from the Palestinian people and you want a nation, a Palestinian state that people are comfortable with existing, not just Israelis, by the way, that Saudi Arabians and Jordanians and Egyptians and Qataris all are comfortable with existing in their backyard, there needs to be scrutiny on Hamas too. So, yeah, it's, as far as the US's involvement, right? Because that's my personal connection to this outside of being a human. I am concerned that we're not putting sufficient pressure on Israel to actually have a constructive long-term vision that they've articulated to the world and that they're moving toward. And we're just giving them $3.8 billion a year through this memorandum of understanding with no strings attached, no real conditions or ethical standards that we're attaching to this. And I don't think it makes sense for any nation to get unconditional aid from the US. And I acknowledge that there are benefits and there's an ideological alignment that Israel has with the US that other nations in the Middle East don't. I get that. And look, I'm even willing to acknowledge that, hey, there's a shared Judeo-Christian values that's driving some of this. It's true, right? Because the US, we have separation of church and state, but a lot of what drove the humanist values that were declared in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution come from Christianity, or at least deism. So I get that there's ideological alignment between Israel and the US. I'm not saying we shouldn't be allies, but having unconditional aid to another country, especially when this other country is engaging in a war that's tremendously unpopular and makes the US look bad and brings back animosity on the US, it's like, no, I don't like that as an American taxpayer. So yeah, we can have alliances, and I get that, we sell arms to Israel, and sometimes they use those arms in ways that give U.S. military good intelligence on the efficacy of those arms, and they give us valuable intel in the Middle East, and they're a bulwark against the Islamic Republic in the Middle East, and they're a bulwark against Iran, and Iran transdebt to America. All that stuff makes sense, and we should not be giving unconditional aid to anyone. And we should be conscious of the influence of any foreign government in the US. And we have a particular affinity, I would notice, I would point out, for Israel versus any other ally that we seem to have in the world. So yeah, we can say, hey, we're against Hamas, we want to defeat them. But we should be pushing these people who are running the Israeli government to articulate the big picture plan. And actually, we should be helping them not repeat the same mistakes that the US made in the global war on terror. Because it seems that we just replaced Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda with ISIS and the Taliban in the same region. So again, there needs to be a vision of more than just devastation. We need to have creation. So those are some thoughts. Let's see what you guys are saying. Sorry for the audio issues at the beginning. To repeat, I'm just going to quickly bullet point what I said at the beginning here. So basically, so you guys understand what the latest is in the news. I think it was yesterday, the US announced that we are pulling back our negotiation teams that were stationed in Qatar to engage with Hamas, because Hamas has expressed no desire to actually come to some sort of peaceable agreement and is not acting in good faith. And after we pulled out, Israel also pulled out as well. And this comes on the back of this past weekend reports of shootings at food aid depots by Israeli Defense Force upon Palestinian civilians. And the Israeli Defense Force claims that it's because some of the people in the crowd were actually armed and some of those people were actually behaving erratically and IDF needed to defend themselves. Now it's unclear what actually happening at those food sites because there's very limited independent third-party verification, right? So some of the pro-Palestinian camp is claiming that it's Israeli propaganda. Some of the Israeli camp is claiming that it's Hamas propaganda. What we know for a fact is that many people are starving and dying, and there's not enough food getting into the region. So I started off this entire essay by asking the question, what does defeating Hamas actually mean? Because what's happening right now does not look like defeating Hamas. It actually looks like perpetuating the same resentment that created the extremism that Israel is trying to defend itself from in the first place, and creating a lot of short-term pain for long-term gain, but actually in the process creating the same monsters that Israel's trying to defeat right now. Because if you're a little kid, if you're a little boy, and your experience of the last a year and a half is starving, watching your family struggle, watching your mom struggle, watching your sister struggle, watching your friends die, watching your buildings get bombed, watching your entire way of life gets disrupted. And then you have to suffer the humiliation of not having enough food because your entire environment was, your entire food infrastructure was destroyed. And you're getting food rationed by people in Israeli uniforms. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty likely to radicalize you. So there needs to be a longer term plan. And part of the plan needs to involve force, right? Because Hamas needs to be met with force to a degree. But I'm seeing force and no vision. So I want to see some vision. Okay, now I'm going to read the comments, see what you guys are saying, see what your thoughts. I welcome them. As I said in the beginning, look, I'm just not interested in picking sides here. I don't see any reason for me to pick sides as like a black guy living in LA in the US. Like, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian, I'm not Middle Eastern. I just want to see the loss of human life end. And I'm really tired of every time there's a discussion, it's just a bunch of name calling and hyperbole. So that's what I want to see comments about. So lay them on me. Okay. Doe asks, Gaza is surrounded by 40 plus Muslim countries. Why won't any of them take in Palestinian refugees? In point of fact, I believe that Egypt does have Palestinian refugees. Let's look this up. So I'm going to do the thing where we pull up AI and we talk to AI, yeah? We're going to discover this ourselves because I'm pretty sure there have been Palestinian refugees entering other countries. Better question, just a teaching moment, a better question is, to what extent have Gazan refugees been allowed into neighboring countries? So, ChatGPT. No, where's my Grok window? There we go. So let's ask that question, yeah? To what extent have other Middle Eastern countries allowed in Gazan refugees? It's not true that Hamas could simply return the hostages and all the pressure to end this suffering would be on Israel. I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I was going to correct you, but you're right that if Hamas surrendered the hostages, then there would be more moral pressure on Israel to end the war. But if you look at it from Hamas's perspective, the hostages are leverage. That's why you keep hostages. And if you don't, they certainly don't have the upper hand economically or militarily. So from their perspective, the longer that they hold the hostages, the longer they get to try to dictate terms of a ceasefire. And the moment they give up their hostages, like if you're Hamas and you don't trust the Israeli government, you think, okay, well, the moment we give up the hostages, they're just going to literally kill us all, because then they don't have to worry about hurting their own people. So you have to understand, it's like, it's easy to say that, but this is a low trust environment. It's a no trust environment. In fact, there's like no trust between Hamas and the Israeli government. right? The Israeli government believes, hey, if we relinquish any control, these people are going to kill us. And they look at October 7th, like, see what happens when we relinquish any control. That's why we need to remove these people from the region and completely dismantle the infrastructure. And if you're Hamas, you look at the situation that they were in, it's like, yeah, well, the Palestinian people have been controlled by Israel for decades now. So the only way that we can get free of the control is if we have leverage. Because when we didn't have leverage, it's not like they released the blockades. So I hope you understand, like, it's not as simple as, oh, well, it's just one side. If one side capitulates and the other side is completely trustworthy, right? It doesn't make any sense from a game theory perspective. You would never do that if you didn't trust the other side. So yes, look at that. Over 100,000 Palestinians, highlight this for you guys, have crossed over into Egypt since 2023. Yeah, so there's plenty of Palestinians who have entered the region. Jordan has explicitly rejected taking in Gazan refugees. Wow, this is crazy. Lebanon has over 500,000 Palestinian refugees. Syria has over 500,000 Palestinian refugees. Yeah, so other nations have taken in Palestinian refugees. Quite a lot of them, approaching like 750,000. So yeah, they have pitched in, and I think unfortunately they need to pitch in more, and not by necessarily taking in more people, but by getting involved in the governance. Like, I would like to see some of these neighboring Arab nations actually get involved in the governance and just create some sort of shared administrative zone in Gaza. Because yeah, it also makes sense why Israel will be like, well, we're not going to allow Hamas to run Gaza because we're just going to go through the same thing. And like, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice. Well, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So yeah, I think this is less about taking in Palestinian refugees, and it's more about, hey, can we get some more rational, good faith actors to oversee the region? And can we have those actors be other Arab and Muslim countries who Palestinian people are more likely to trust? That's the real question. Someone says support for the idea Hamas equals destruction of the state of Israel. Yeah, and that's, look, there's always going to be, or maybe not always, but there's going to be an extreme faction of the Palestinian people who care about destroying Israel, right? There's extremists everywhere. We have extremists in America. We have domestic terrorists in America. Everywhere has extremists, and the percentage of the population that's extreme increases or decreases based on the amount of suffering that population is going under, right? So you see, for instance, the Luigi Mangione case. Remember the guy who killed the United Healthcare CEO? Why did that happen? Well, not justifying it at all, but a lot of people are frustrated with the healthcare situation in the US. So not only did Luigi Mangione, or whoever ended up killing the guy, kill them, there was a lot of support. People are deifying Luigi Mangione. And it's insanity, just to be clear, because even if you're frustrated with the healthcare situation, this is not the way to fix your healthcare situation. So the problem with extremism is it's just not an effective way of getting your political goals met, largely at least. But the point here is that if you create better conditions for the Palestinian people, then those extremists will be much more fringe rather than mainstream. And right now, Hamas is mainstream because Palestinian people, yes, have been brainwashed, yes, have been propagandized, but also have been controlled. And no group of people likes being controlled. So I understand why the Israeli government was like, well, we need to control these people because these people are third worlders who are going to attack us if they don't control us. Yeah, but that's not a long-term solution. At best, that's a liminal solution while you get to a point where you create educational reform and cultural reform and economic prosperity in the region. But if you're not willing to do those things, you're just going to try to control people in perpetuity. And if you try to control people in perpetuity, eventually they're going to strike back. It always happens. Always happens. So again, with I think this like hostages release, war ends. I mean, even Israel's not saying, the Israeli government's not saying just release the hostages and the whole war will end. No, they're not saying that. There've actually been offers to release the hostages and they've rejected them. They don't just want the hostages to be released. They want the entire Hamas infrastructure to be dismantled. right? They want total defeat. So it's not enough to just say, oh, we'll just release the hostages. That's an overly simplistic narrative. It's just not true. We can't even aid our own country, let alone Israel. Yeah, I think we got lots of problems here at home. I don't think this is our biggest problem as America, just be clear. I don't even think it's in our top 3. And I think it's consuming a lot of domestic attention. But yeah, we have a deportation crisis to figure out and economic stuff to handle. Those 2 issues are far more important than what's going on overseas. But I think as on a humanitarian level, what's going on in Gaza matters. And it matters to the extent that we are funding Israel, and Israel is partially responsible for what's happening in Gaza. Okay. I think that's it, guys. It's going to be a slightly shorter stream today. Just wanted to really focus in on this one topic. Oh, wait. I always forget the Instagram people. Hold on. Let's see what you guys are saying. I always forget you guys, but not today. Nate's Chip says, bingo. Thank you, Kaizen, for being able to hold and see multiple truths and understand cause and effect, and also how nuanced and charged everything is. Thank you. Someone says the prime minister of Israel funded Hamas. Yeah, just like the U.S. funded Osama bin Laden back in the day, right? It's like in geopolitics, your friends become enemies and enemies become friends very quickly. And I don't even think it's like some nefarious thing. I imagine Netanyahu's, I mean, some people think Netanyahu's just evil, but I look at this like if I assume good faith and just strategy, I look at it as he probably wanted to fund Hamas because he didn't want Palestine to become a unified state, and he viewed Hamas as being some sort of as a counterweight against other Palestinian parties in the region. Because remember, Hamas is not, they're not all the governance of Palestine. There's also Fatah and Palestinian Authority, right? So I imagine he viewed them as a wedge to try to create a divided Palestine, and it backfired. Just like we did with Osama bin Laden to try to be a bulwark against the Soviets in the region. And we trained him, and then he ended up backfiring. So are we seeing a trend here? It's almost like we don't want to meddle so much in the affairs of other countries because it seems to always end up shooting us in the foot. That's my bigger thing. I think we need to have a more isolationist stance as a US. Not all the way. Like, I think it's good to have economic relationships and all, but all of this like covert, like backing terrorists in foreign countries because those terrorists serve us in the short term, and then we're going to deal with it long term, and then they blow up our buildings, and then we invade the whole country. It's like, I get that America, look, saying the quiet part out loud, America's an empire, right? America is the spiritual successor of the Roman Empire, and empires do dirty things to maintain their empire status. And I don't expect America to relinquish its global empire, but can we please not meddle in the affairs of cultures and countries that we don't understand, and then antagonize them to the point where they attack us, and then we invade their whole country and we spend trillions of dollars and break the national spirit. But yeah. Okay, someone's already calling people names in the chat. That person's getting ignored. See, the moment I see people calling each other names in the chat, it's like, yeah, that means you're intellectually compromised. You're being emotional. It's not necessary. And no one's here to insult each other. We're here to identify constructive solutions. And if you don't like the constructive solution I identified, there's a way to do that civilly, like an adult, without name calling. So a bad way to get my attention is by calling names. I don't even know if the person's calling me names or someone in the chat, but just grow up. What are we doing? This kind of like, it's funny how people will just be like, wow, why is there so much conflict and division in the world? And why is it that Israel and Palestine can't figure it out when people can't even jump on an online chat room and be civil to one another? It's like, if we can't be civil on an individual level, when there's low stakes, if you're sitting here and watching a stream right now, and thank you for watching, this is like very low stakes. You're just on an internet chat room with a bunch of strangers. If you can't maintain your composure there, of course we can't maintain our composure on a geopolitical level. So let's not do that. Someone said, "Can we kick the bot?" Sorry, I don't have any moderators in the chat, so I'm not like actively moderating like who's a bot versus not. So sorry about that. Wow, the Instagram chat's popping. There's only 30 people watching on Instagram. It's like 3,000 or 4,000 on X, and there's like as much chat on Instagram as anywhere else. Why is that? Yes, I am also sick of the ignorance and hatred cycle. MSOK. Maybe bring some people on board for future talks. I'm open to it. I also don't like it when people say like, "Oh, you're not allowed to talk about things unless you have a representative from every side." And it's like, no, no, that doesn't seem to stop anyone else, first of all. And I do my best to research as well as I can. I recognize I have blind spots and I don't know the Israeli perspective as well as an Israeli would. I don't know the Palestinian perspective as well as the Palestinian would. But I think it's still valuable to give my take. I know you're not saying I shouldn't give my take. But I think it's still valuable to give my take. And I think it's okay for people outside of groups to comment on the behavior of the groups. And I think that it's actually important because sometimes the groups themselves has blind spots that they're unwilling to acknowledge because it's really scary sometimes to speak out against your group. For instance, as a Black person, on the last stream, I talked about, I don't know if you guys saw this clip. Well, you saw it if you watched the last episode, but there was this clip of this Black man who got pulled over by a white cop, and the Black man was resistant to the cop. So the cop broke open the window and then he punched the Black man in the face. And I pointed out that the white cop shouldn't be punching the guy in the face. It was not necessary. The guy wasn't violently resisting arrest. He didn't have a gun. There was none of that going on. So he over escalated. And also the Black man over escalated by resisting a lawful request for his license and registration and to pull over his car. But yeah, it's like when I say things that are critical of my group, right, being a Black man, I attract attack. So it's like, unfortunately, we all have blind spots that are built on tribalism, and sometimes people outside of the group who are not as attached to being accepted by the group are also necessary to comment on stuff. But yeah, I mean, I did. I don't know. I spoke to someone on. There's an interview on my YouTube channel with someone who, I don't know if she'd consider herself a Zionist, but I would think it's fair to say she was like more sympathetic to Israel. And I actually want to go to the region. I actually want to go to Israel, Palestine. And so you guys know, I have been offered trips to the region by pro-Israel organizations. And I don't think they had any nefarious intention. They were just like, hey, this guy seems reasonable and we want more people to get a direct firsthand view of the situation. And I've actually rejected that, as well as money, because I want to make sure that if I go to the region, I'm going in with as neutral a perspective as possible. So just so you guys know, some people will never believe me, but just so you guys know, I've literally refused money and free trips because I really care about the sovereignty of my own mind. And I believe that I could be sovereign even if someone paid for my own trip, but it's certainly an influence that would cause people to question and doubt my perspective. And I don't even want to have to deal with that because there's enough people just making shit up on the internet every time you give an opinion without giving them more ammunition. So just so you guys know. Thank you, Nate's Chips. Appreciate the affirmation. Let's see. Thank you, Cristaldi. Yeah, I think everyone should speak their minds. I think it's okay if people. I don't think we shouldn't be gatekeeping people giving their opinions. And one of the things I find actually really unproductive about the Israel-Palestine conflict is people saying stuff like, "You don't know your history." That's like the first thing I hear, both from the pro-Israel camp and the pro-Palestine camp. I actually had a bit of I don't know if it was a falling out with a friend, but definitely a disconnect created when I was just I'm not going to tell you what side of the conflict they were on. They're definitely on a side, and I was just like questioning, for the sake of not just accepting the narrative, and like I want to make sure that their ideas are being put under tension. And it just feels like this, like, what is it? It's almost like an ad hominem attack. Ad hominem from the Latin meaning to the person, like attacking the person, where people just try to disqualify you because of your background or they say you don't know the history, but they're not being specific about what history you don't know, rather than just engaging with the merits of what's being said in the moment, in real time. Like, that's what we need to be doing. And my belief is, like, I never want to disqualify the person giving the argument, because if their argument is bad and you have a better argument, it will become obvious that their argument is bad when you provide a better argument. That's the way that we need to be engaging. But unfortunately, people are shutting down conversation around Israel Palestine and pretty much every issue this happens, but Israel Palestine in particular, because there is so much history. And I think history and expertise and knowledge are very important for sure. And also, I think there's basic first principles, common sense intuitions that we all share that people can observe. Like, for example, hey, I get that Israel needs to defend themselves against Hamas, and also there's a lot of people who are malnourished, and children who are starving, and we want to make sure that we minimize that, even if we are in support of Israel achieving their goals. And we want to understand what happens after the violence. Is there a plan for not just dismantling Hamas, but also building up the Palestinian people? Or are we just going to see the same thing play out every decade and a half or so? And you'll notice maybe that I'm not super big into like moral equivalence games, like who's more right and more wrong, just because I think it's a massive red herring. I really don't think that's necessary unless you're trying to like pick a side. I think we need to go beyond sides and be able to say, hey, what are the merits and demerits of what this side is saying? What are the merits and demerits of what this side is saying? What are the shared goals that we have? How can we reach a compromise that's constructive? That's the important thing to do. Okay, I think that's it, guys. Good stream today. I will be back on Monday for another episode of Nuanced. Thanks for watching. I'm also going to make a short form video on this. It's going to be my first one in a while. I've honestly felt a bit creatively blocked, but today I felt inspired to talk about this. So you guys can look out for a short form video on this. If you're also interested, if you go on my Instagram profile, it's also there on X. I made a video more talking to the Free Palestine camp and asking, like, what does Free Palestine actually mean? Because we got to talk about Hamas if we want to talk about Free Palestine. So today's video is going to be more addressed to the pro-Israel camp. What does defeating Hamas actually mean? So I just want both sides to think. So thanks for watching. Have a great weekend. See you Monday. Peace.